Greetings, my name's Andrew Sumner. My grandfather, Pop Smythe, bought me my first comic book in Liverpool, England, when I was 3 years old, and I spent the next 50 years hurtling around the pop culture kaleidoscope, first as a fan, and then as a journalist, editor, publisher and presenter. Along the way, I met a bunch of interesting people who will be joining me here, creators, performers, professionals and public servants. We live in divisive, fractured times, but art and popular culture connect people from all viewpoints and from all walks of life. I'm often struck by the passions people enjoy, that they can set aside their differences for and agree on whatever those passions are, whether I share them or not. And that spark, that moment of instinctive, connective agreement, that's what I call a hard agree. Mate, you were just about to tell me about your impending guys weekend.
Not much to tell yet. Hopefully there's more to tell afterwards. No, it's just a bunch of losers in their late 50s getting together.
That's my kind of loser, mate.
Pretending that they can cause trouble. And it's just, it's the kind of thing we would do once or twice a year in one way or another, which is always, I have two separate kind of groups of friends. Some of them overlap, but not all of them. So I would do like two different things, with the two different friends, along with conventions and all that stuff. It's just I like getting away. I've been in the house for a year now. I've been here since we've not really gone anywhere since March of last year. So I just look forward to hanging out. And we're doing it since everything's clearing up. Like we had like a dinner on the porch where I did the last interview with you. We had like 4 couples out there having dinner a couple weeks ago, which was really nice because we hadn't done that in a long time. So it's good to start. It's good to start having a semblance of a social life. I don't mind being a hermit, but then you start to realize, wait, you need some interaction. You need some activity with people.
Yeah, mate, I couldn't agree more. And that's the thing, I think everybody's coped quite well with the pandemic and being locked away at home and all that kind of stuff. But here in the UK, as we speak, the pubs and restaurants have just like reopened properly. They're open so you could sit outside for pre-ordered meals and stuff. Yeah. But literally now pubs and bars, you can actually walk in them and get a drink just, on spec. And I took a walk last night, around where I live in West London, and then I just popped into a pub and had a drink and a bite to eat, and it just felt so human and normal. Yep.
And that's what I'm looking forward to that too. I mean, the takeout stuff is all well and good, but sometimes, like you say, you just want to sit at a bar and have a beer. You just want to, and it's not quite the same unless you're sitting in that kind of an environment. So hopefully it keeps going. Hopefully none of these variants kick our asses, and hopefully China doesn't have anything else cooking up in a lab somewhere. Hopefully Russia doesn't have anything cooking up in a lab that they could try to blame China for. Hopefully.
I mean, it's a big fingers crossed, mate. We shall see. I think the next year in the world of the pandemic is going to be kind of a glorious adventure, right? And there's this really good podcast I listen to that's run by The Economist, and most of the time I know it's called The Jab, and it's by I'd never read The Economist, I've never read it in my life, but this is by their scientific team, which I know is considered to be good. And it's like an easily explainable weekly roundup of what's actually happened with regard to the vaccine and the medicine that's fighting the vaccine and the science of it all. And mostly I've found that heartening to listen to. But some of the time I listen to it and think, oh my God, this is going to be with us for a long, long time.
Yeah, I think it's going to be with us for a long time, like any flu is. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
To me, I'm curious. I'm going to check that podcast out just because I'm curious about it. I have 0 issues with the science. I have 150% issue with human beings. So
I couldn't agree more.
The fact that the science has accomplished what it's accomplished in the last year is phenomenal. And incredible. The fact that the human species has shown itself so much, a percentage of it has shown itself to be what it is also phenomenal. You know, so it's just. I really wish that we could eliminate borders and geographic zones and separate people by intelligence level. And then that way, those who want to be like that can be together and leave those who don't want to be like that alone, so we don't have to deal with it on a daily basis.
You and I are totally on the same page about this. And I guess before we go any further with this conversation, I'll just say, welcome to Hard Agree. I'm here with one of my favorite authors, Fabian Nicieza. Fabian and I had a chat recently for my day job about a book of his that we're just about to publish, Suburban Dicks, and I want to talk some more about that in a little bit. Come on, go Suburban Dicks, which is a phenomenal book, and anybody tuning into this really needs to check it out. It's published by Titan Books in the UK and Europe, the rest of the world, and to have a different publisher in the US, Fabian.
Yes, Putnam. It's Putnam Publishing.
Okay, yeah, brilliant. Okay,
in North American territories.
Yeah, okay. So if you listen to this in the States, you want to buy it from Putnam, and if you listen to this in the UK and Europe, you'll want to buy it from Titan. But it is
if you live anywhere in the solar system, you can probably just buy it from Amazon, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. What am I even? I mean, that's a really good point. Do people even who buy books even drill down? I'm one of those people that I've always known whenever I've seen a movie or a TV show, and most of the people who work in the media that I know are like this, are aware of who has actually made the movie, what the studios that's made the movie, who's directed it, who's written it. And same with publishers. I'm always aware of who's published a book. But what I've realized, given the fact that most of my extended family, virtually all of them, do not work in the media and have what you call regular jobs, I came to realize a while back that they didn't notice any of that stuff. Who's produced a movie? No, they don't even. A lot of people go to the movies. This fascinates me, or read books, and sometimes don't know who the author is, and sometimes don't know who's made the film, and sometimes can't even name the actor 5 minutes after they've seen it. I mean, I find that truly incredible.
The easiest example I think of that is just ask any civilian who has seen a Marvel Studios movie in the last 10 years, billions of people, what the difference is between Marvel Studios and a Fox made Marvel movie like X-Men. They don't have that, civilians don't have a clue about that difference, right? So they don't understand it,
Right.
Why can't the X-Men be in Avengers? Well, they couldn't. So, and as far as book publishing is concerned, I really have been a willfully ignorant participant in books for quite a long time now, and I find it interesting getting back into the game, as it were, to pay attention to book publishing, because I would just read a book based on an author or based on word of mouth or a combination of the two. It was rarely ever with an awareness of who's publishing it. I'm on a Michael Connelly binge, like I told you last time. And I got to be honest with you, I've just probably read 15 of his books in the last 6 months or so, 5 months. I don't know what publisher publishes him. And I've already read that many books because I'm not paying attention to the title page and I'm reading it digitally. So I don't see the spine of the cover or anything like that. I just know who's publishing my book. That I'm aware of.
It's such a good point though, mate, because in this era of, I don't read a great deal of things digitally because I like to have, the physical sensation. But nonetheless, leading a life where I travel in a normal year, I travel such a lot, has led me to consuming books that way. And you're absolutely right. You don't have the normal checks and balances that if you're a book fan and you read a lot, one of the reasons somebody's published a book is it's there on the spine every time you pick it up. But if it's only on page one and you never see page one again, of course, it's not the forefront of your mind.
And then, my attitude is not all that different than it's really ever been. I don't care if you spell the name right as long as you read it, And I honestly don't even. It's not right to say I don't care whether you like it or not, because I do care, but I have a real healthy sense of distance between my engagement between whether you like it or not. That's up to you. That's on you. My attitude about that has always been, I don't care if you like it or don't like it. as long as you paid to read it, So, or even, and that even comes down to taking it out from the library. That's fine for me too, as long as you didn't pirate it. Your opinion is your own, And I've had that for a really long time, since very early in my writing career, because I was placed into situations that had a lot of strong fan opinion about the characters or the books I was writing or the creators who had come before me. And it allowed me a sense of perspective that would prevent me from beating myself up constantly. There's more than enough I beat myself up about as it is. I don't need you to be the problem or the reason. I prefer all of my insecurities to be internally driven, not externally provided.
Yeah, I think that's very wise, and you're kind of backing into one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about, because the premise of the podcast, Hard Agree, it's about the things about which we are passionate and we can agree with it. We strongly agree with people in our lives about, not necessarily you and I agreeing, although I'm sure that we will, but whatever it is you feel strongly about. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit as a way into that about your journey into the comic book world. But you, of course, had long tenures on some massive Marvel titles. You're the co-creator of Deadpool. You had those amazing runs on X-Men. And I guess that's the period that you are the most identified with, right, Fabian, in terms of your comics career. And you also created, as you know, and we've talked about before, one of my favorite Marvel books, which is your version of Two Gun Kid, which I absolutely loved. But in that lengthy career that you had working at Marvel, am I right in that I think one of the things that you and I have in common is that I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, that you're a writer who actually began by working in production. Yeah?
Yes, I did. I started in book production, actually, initially out of college. I got a job at Berkeley Publishing, which was a subsidiary of Putnam Publishing. What a coincidence. Not. Yeah. And I started literally in the production department of Berkeley Publishing. And then I moved up to managing editorial. So it was really about the nuts and bolts of getting the book to print or to the printers. It wasn't really about writing or editorial content. And I would have had aspirations towards that, obviously, had I stayed at Berkeley Putnam, but a job opportunity awarded itself at Marvel, which again was in production. It was the production department for their nascent book division. And that was really dealing with the material coming from the Marvel Books editorial group, which was really tiny back then because it wasn't comic book trade paperbacks or hardcovers the way you think about them today, and then dealing with the outside vendors, the separators, the printers, the paper manufacturers. Luckily, I only did that job for like 4 months because it's not what I really wanted to do. I just really used it to get my foot in the door. And then I got to move to a department where I really wanted to work, which was the promotions and advertising.
So this is fascinating to me because I'm a journalist who started work in the production department, and the early years of my life, I worked for Macmillan Publishers book division very briefly, but then spent a long period of time, years, working for the magazines division here in the UK, and working on magazine production, everything that you've just mentioned, while I used to freelance as a journalist in the evenings, and I think it's an interesting thing to begin. Working in production.
You're an evening journalist.
Yeah, an evening journalist.
A journalist of the night.
Journalist of the night. Yeah, exactly. That was my, Batman-esque alter ego. Like somebody who would project, an image of a typewriter onto the clouds. And
I just saw you standing on the street corner in a trench coat and a car pulling up and saying, "Hey, you a journalist?
Yeah.
How much for a paragraph?"
Yeah, that was it. That's uncannily close to what my actual life is like. But I think it's interesting to work in book and magazine production, in production of anything, actually, understanding the nuts and bolts of it all is, as your career goes along, you realize how kind of invaluable it is and how much of an edge it gives you sometimes in just talking about the fabric of publishing stuff, because a lot of people, of course, work in the publishing business who flat out don't understand how it's put together. And the basic things, if you worked in production, like the fact that basically books have got to be divisible by 4, they've got to be divisible by 8. All that stuff that you just know it's in your blood. It's amazing how many people write and how many people illustrate don't know any of that stuff.
Yeah, well, for me, it goes even beyond that. As far as comic books was concerned, I learned really quickly that editorial was a bit of its own island, and they were either willfully or negligently unaware of the nuts and bolts of the company's functions, the different
Yes.
departments, not just sales or promotion or production, the bullpen, which automatically and immediately interacted with them on a daily basis. They didn't understand international publishing. They didn't understand licensing. They just didn't know how those other departments did their jobs. And I got really, really lucky by being Marvel's advertising manager, because I was engaged with every single department in the company to one capacity or another on a regular basis. And not only did it get me to know other people in other departments and have them know me, but it let me learn about what they were doing and how they did it. And I think that benefited me tremendously when it actually came time to writing more and being an editor myself, when I finally became an editor. And even when I was an editor, I was always a little bit surprised. At Post Shooter, Jim Shooter at Marvel, the company opened up a bit, and there was more interaction between departments than there had been during the latter years of his tenure, which is when I started. But even then, even with that opening up, even with that greater interaction, editorial still had a bit of a bunker mentality. I never quite understood it, but I simply accepted it and tried to take advantage of it for myself.
I mean, I think it's that way in many publishing companies, having worked in quite a few of them myself over here in the UK. And I used to work for Time Warner. I used to work for Time Inc. I used to work for a company called IPC. I used to work for a company called EMAP, which back in the day are all the big publishing companies over here. And I suspect that what lies at the heart of that, honestly, having spent 30 years of my career thinking about it, it's probably elitism more than anything else. I think it's you touched upon it. I think it's willful. I think it's a willful bunker mentality, because in a way, if you're the editorial team of a magazine or of a publishing company, you're essentially the rock stars of that business, right? The editors of high profile mass market like newsstand titles, they are they're the directors in that industry or what have you. Yeah. And I think the overriding thing is, it's like they don't need to know the rest of it, because it's everybody else's job to do that for them. But I think you're absolutely right. I think if you take the time to drill into, it's like any environment you work in. If you take time to drill and get to know everybody, get to have good relationships with everybody, it's hugely beneficial for your work.
Yeah, and well, the other thing is that when you get to know people on the other side of the wall as people rather than the ones on the other side of the wall, it changes your dynamic. It changes your perspective. And if you don't want to change your perspective, then you're doing yourself a disservice. You're doing the other person a disservice, but also you're doing the company you work for a disservice, Yeah. So to me, getting to know everybody helped me deal with them as individuals rather than as departments or members of a department, because even within an accounting department, there's different personalities. So get to know the personalities and know which ones are going to work with you and which ones aren't. Avoid the ones who aren't, and deal with the ones who will. You can't throw a blanket over a group of people and say they are that.
Yeah.
And I guess what? That applies to life as well as it applies.
That's exactly what I was just going to say. Yeah,
working within a company. So. Yeah. But I always approached everything with a completely undeserved, healthy arrogance and conceit about everything. So to me, whether you were a good guy or a bad guy, worked in a good department or a bad department, you were still a human being, and that made you 90% stupid. So I was,
I think that's
worked my way around that. I worked within the context of understanding you were an idiot. Yeah. So it was so noble of me to just automatically make everyone equally stupid. There you go.
So Fabian, how did he manage to make that transition within Marvel from production to advertising and promotion? What was the conduit to do?
Oh, well, just within 4 months of working there, the guy who had gotten the job that I had also interviewed for in 1983. So now we're talking about it's 1986 because I started in August of 85. So we're looking at like January of 86. The guy who got the job instead of me when we both were apparently the last two, the two finalists for the job at Marvel in 83, his name is Steve Saffel, was looking to hire an assistant because his workload was continuing to increase as a result of the direct market continuing to increase in the mid 80s. So he was looking to hire an assistant. And I was completely interested in working in promotions and advertising because that's what I went to college for. And my gut was that I knew I could make a mark in the company through that. I knew that I could really do a lot positively, not just for myself or my own career or my desires to write eventually. Remember, I was like 25 years old. It was that I knew that I could make a stamp and a positive imprint for the company, for comics, forever. I really had that strong confidence and belief. So I wanted that job. It was actually a pay cut to take that job by a little bit from what I was earning in the production department job. But I wanted it. So he offered it to me and I accepted it. And the poor woman who hired me, I left her after 4 months, but it was for a reason. It was not to sound too hyperbolic, but it was for a greater purpose for me. By far, a greater purpose for me would be to advertise and promote the comics than it would be for me to work in a production capacity. So that's why I did it, and then I just seamlessly moved over. And within a month or so of Steve hiring me, he didn't know that someone was being hired over him to, in essence, develop a promotion and publicity department that would be responsible for servicing the entire company, not necessarily just as an adjunct of direct sales, which is what Steve's role had originally been. So a man named Mark Erickson was hired as vice president of promotions and publicity, I think it was called. Steve was folded under him. And since I was with Steve, I was folded under Mark. And then Pam Rutt, who was the publicity director of Marvel at that time, was folded into his department. And so was advertising sales, which really was a two-person crew because the running joke was the guy who ran advertising sales would be done with his job by the end of January because they sold 4-month flats. And he would sell all the ads for all the flats for each of the quarterly, they were 3-month flats. So it was four quarters, 3 months each quarter, and the same ads you bought ran for 3 months. So January, February, March, and then he needed to make sure we had ads for April, May, June. And for the most part, he was done with his job back then by January. And I'm not kidding. He'd show up at the office maybe one day a week because he had done his job. Technically, he had done his job. So he was folded into that department too. And then we didn't have our own work area at the time because there was still expansion going on. So we were all kind of separated for the first year. I think we didn't all come together until we opened up more space on the 9th floor. And then we had our own little, department area down on the 9th floor.
Which iteration of the bullpen were you at this point? Which version of the Marvel offices were you?
Oh, we were at 387 Park Avenue South, and it was the shooter year. So it was really post Madison Avenue. They moved over to Park Avenue South about 3 years before I started, and we were there until quite a few years after I left, and I left in 95. So they were there at that office until late 90s. And that was when we were expanding because we were the ninth, we were half the 9th, the 10th, and the 11th floor. So then we became all of the 9th, the 10th, the 11th, a penthouse office area up on the roof. That's where Joe Quesada and Jimmy Palmiotti eventually had their Marvel Knights offices, the bastards, because it was a cool area. I know that during renovations of the 10th floor, at one point, we were down on 4 for half a year or a year. There's other people who have a much better recollection of the dates and the years. And because of how much work I was doing, I've always had a little bit of a blur of memory when I try to recall anything from 89 to 93 in terms of where were we? I don't know. I moved 3 times, I think, just when I was an editor alone, to different offices. And my old assistant, Evan, will go, no, we weren't in the office, over there at that point. We were in the office in the middle at that point. I'm like, oh, we were? Okay. My recollections of that time editorially is really more by flash moments, like something happened that, oh yeah, I knew I was in the middle office in the bullpen area because I remember the day Bob Harris asked me to script an X-Men issue overnight, and I said no, and behind Bob's shoulder, through the glass wall that we had in each of our offices, I saw Scott Lobdell walking down the hallway to go to Terry Kavanaugh's office. And I looked at Bob, and Bob looked at me, and he goes, no. I go, yes. And he goes, no. And I go, yes. And he goes, oh. And I go, he's going to do a great job. And Bob went out and chased Scott Lobdell down and asked him to script an issue overnight. And Scott, of course, did it and did a good job, and ended up becoming one of the X-Men writers, And so Scott's never-ending agita to my heart is the result of me saying, go for it, go get him, because I'm not going to script an issue over Byrne overnight.
No way. Mate, that is brilliant. I mean, in terms of the personalities who were around at that time when you were an editor and before you were an editor and whatnot, I just wanted to back up on, how did you find Shooter personally? What was your experience of him?
I was very young, and my initial interactions with Jim were based on my role as advertising manager.
Yeah.
And he was incredibly accommodating, incredibly fair, not the most personable, fun-loving, jokey kind of guy, but he had a lot of pressure on him. He had a lot of responsibility, and there was turmoil beginning to percolate above the surface rather than below the surface at that point. So in 86 was really my first main interactions with him. And they were not negative in any way. You hear a lot of things, though, from other people. So some are negative and some are okay. So you have to start to balance that out. Look for signs on your own as to whether you're getting a negative reaction or you're getting a status quo reaction. I got more involved with him when the New Universe line had to be reduced in size so soon after it started publishing. I think it was like 15-ish, a year in, the sales were not there. It was a real problematic launch for the company on many levels. Myself as an advertising manager was not wholly supportive of the entire endeavor. It didn't stop me from doing my job in advertising it. I just didn't think it was the right thing for the company to be doing in the way they were doing it. That makes it hard to be very enthusiastic about promoting something you don't strongly believe in. But it had also given me my first writing opportunity. And when the line had to be reduced from 8 titles to 4 titles, Jim gave all 4 titles to one editor instead of how they had been diffused among a bunch of different editors, which also was probably a mistake because it prevented the line from having a sense of cohesion to it editorially, in terms of the voice and tone in the book, and Howard Mackey became that editor, and Howard had no choice, but I was going to be the monthly writer of Sci-Force because Jim said so. So on the one hand, I'm getting a monthly book, not even 6 months after I sold my first issue. But on the other hand, if Jim is saying he's going to be the writer, then an already very trepidatious editorial department is going to look at me negatively, So I was really on the fence there. And in some ways for my career, I was very fortunate that Jim didn't last much longer. And it sounds horrible to say, but it's been 30 years and Jim and I had multiple meals together. So I can say that because the fact he got fired then allowed me to earn my keep on my own and build a relationship with the editor on my own without being the golden boy, as it were, in quotation marks, because that would have been an aspersion. So I heard a lot of really bad things about Jim from a lot of people, and they are all people I respect and trust and are friends with. That having been said, though, I believe that people can easily be prone to groupthink exaggeration. And
I agree with that. Yeah.
Boogeyman is when they have been put upon, and a slight that might be a 6 on the scale turns into a 9 on the scale, just like that,
Yeah.
And I think Jim's not innocent or exonerated in the role he played to create divisions within editorial or the divisions that existed within the company. And I just, right before the pandemic hit, we were at a convention together, I think down in Kentucky. And so we spent a tremendous amount of time together that weekend. And I respect him a lot. I like to hear him talk about comics and storytelling. I listen to his stories about Marvel with curious interest, because I probably would believe half of what he says to be true, and 25% of what he says I know isn't true, and then 25% of what he says could be true. And as far as Jim is concerned, it's not anything I wouldn't say to him directly. Sometimes we make ourselves the hero of the story, whether we were or not. That's understandable. I don't agree with making yourself the hero of every story, because that's that's not realistic. That's not realistic, And often I feel that Jim makes himself the hero of every story. And again, I get that too psychologically, because he's gotten so much shit for so long from so many people who knew nothing, because most of the people who were on the inside didn't talk at the time and didn't really talk afterwards publicly. They kept it to themselves. They might have talked among friends, but then it becomes a game of telephone. By the time you hear the story that I heard from me, that I heard from someone else, who heard it from someone else who was there, who knows what's what, But Jim has told his own story a lot, and other people that were involved and affected or affecting the situation really never did. I never saw a book. I never saw Mike Hobson, the publisher, write a book. I never saw Tom DeFalco, the editor, the executive editor who became editor-in-chief, write a book.
Well, I was going to ask you, how was it for you personally on the transition from Shooter to Tom DeFalco? How did you find the Tom DeFalco era?
I think that the Tom DeFalco era for the first 5 years was a phenomenally positive and successful time for the company. I think that him and Mark Grunwald, who was the executive editor, and then ultimately, Bob Budiansky becoming executive editor of Special Project, and Carl Potts becoming executive editor of Epic. I think all of them brought a general positivity and interactivity within the company that really made it a fantastic place to work from 88 to 92. I personally think the editor-in-chief job is a job you should probably do for 5 years, because if you're doing it right, you've made your mark, and then it's either time for someone else to make their mark, or you start to make mistakes. You start to either repeat mistakes that you've already made, which compounds them, or you try to find something to fix that doesn't need fixing. And that was a problem that Jim had, in my opinion. Jim, for all intents and purposes, Jim created the system of editorial administrative function that exists at Marvel Comics to this day. Jim created it, and he turned an absolute mess of the 70s into a professionally organized department whose job it was to produce comics first and foremost, and their secondary job, whether they want to admit this as being the reality or not, the secondary job was trying to produce good comics on a regular basis. But when we were on the newsstand, the primary job was to produce comics on a monthly basis, because you couldn't lose out on that newsstand slot. And Jim did that. And then as a result of literally creating that, then he started to micromanage in a way that it didn't need, because you've already hired the people who can do their jobs. And when you can't let them do their jobs, that's when problems start. And Tom got to a point where I think that there was so much pressure on him by the time the Perlman Group took over and the company went public and we had stock issues to deal with. There was so much pressure on him to produce content far and above the ability for the department to produce it, far and above the ability of the market to absorb it. And that's a bad equation. So what ended up happening is too much mediocre product was going out the door. And it was not to fulfill creative ambition or creative obligations. It was to fulfill financial and corporate obligations and ambition. And that's, again, a really bad equation. So Tom, after 5 years, probably should have walked away. And he, he got fired after 7, I think. And it would have been to his benefit emotionally to just walk away, probably professionally too, because too many people want to cite the bad stuff we did in the 92 to 94 stretch and fail to take into account all the good things that happened that allowed the company to kind of stabilize itself, allowed for much better interaction between departments. All of that, a lot of that was because of Mark and Tom making editorial far more approachable on the face. And Tom could still be crusty and he could still be a curmudgeon, but those of us who knew him well knew that it was 80% act. He did that act a lot just to protect his editors from having to deal with stupid stuff that he didn't want them having to deal with. So Tom was and remains a good friend of mine, and when I get to see him, I love seeing him and I love spending time with him. And his wife now, Hildy Mesnick, was an editor at Marvel too. She took over the Barbie titles after I stopped editing them. So there's a sense of camaraderie there. It was born as much out of the office as it was in the office because I was doing so much convention work and traveling to different retailer events and distributor events. As the advertising manager, I was like I was the one with the microphone on my hand doing the presentations in a lot of these functions. So Tom would be out at those a lot for his job related reasons, or Mark would be out there a lot. So we got to interact outside the office on a social level that enhanced our dynamics in the office, but also gave me an opportunity to have relationships with them in a way that some other people in the office may not have had. There are still people from that time who'll tell you Tom was an ass. He's just a jerk. He's so rough and rude. And I'm like, oh, I get how you think that, but that's not the Tom that I deal with. So it was good, and it was absolutely to my benefit, not as an immediate thing. It wasn't like Tom became editor-in-chief and all of a sudden I had 4 monthly titles. That took me a couple of years to earn my way back to that. I thought when Aside Force, the New Universe books were all canceled, I honestly thought I'm going to have another monthly book in a week. I really did. And it was well over a year and a half before I did. So It was a lot of scut work during that time period, a lot of inventory stories and backups for annuals, and Marvel Comics Presents was gearing up its inventory needs because it was going to be a weekly book. So they were buying, 4 years worth of material all in 1 year, and I sold a lot of 8-page stories for Marvel Comics Presents at that time too. And all of that ultimately ended up both being good for me. It was a very frustrating year, but having to write different size format stories was incredibly beneficial. Having to write inventory stories, which are self-contained one and done issues that can't alter the status quo of a book because it's just meant to be slotted at any given point in time in the schedule when the schedule needs it. It got to expose me to multiple characters and multiple editors, So I wrote a Doctor Strange inventory story for Ralph Macchio, Iron Man inventory story for Howard, Daredevil inventory story for, was that Ralph too? Maybe that was Ralph too. So I got to just interact more with different editors, and they got to know me as a writer, not just as the advertiser.
Once you had the battle over the corporate boardroom battles over the future of Marvel and the ownership of Marvel, what was that like?
It taught me, do not wish for you may receive.
Yeah.
When New World bought the company from Cadence, we thought that was great because that was an entertainment company that would have a far greater understanding of what we can do. New World was a useless owner because they had neither the capital nor the organizational vision to do anything with what we had. So that was a bust. When Perlman bought the company, McAndrews and Forbes was the fund, the management company, whatever, the financial company that he ran, that was buying things as diverse as Coleman, outdoor camping gear, to Revlon, to Marvel Comics. When he bought the company, we thought this is financial capital that can help us expand our marketplace beyond just comics. We can start doing a lot more because we'll have more financial capital to do it. Again, it was a complete naive, idealistic way to think about it. But any worker at any company always wishes that their owner, whether it be an existing one or a new one, is going to bring better times or create better opportunities when you're at that company. We were doing it. We were, in hindsight, we should have been far more confident about ourselves and far more aggressive in how we interacted with our corporate owners, because we were the ones who were increasing the revenue. We were the ones who were increasing the size of the marketplace. Not them. We were doing it. All they were doing was siphoning the money we were earning.
Yeah.
And as our earnings increased on a yearly basis, their demands for us increased exponentially. So you made $250 million on your publishing program. Next year, you got to make $300 million. You made $300 million on your publishing. Next year, you got to make $350 million. The blood, the stone can only give up so much blood, before you've let it dry, right? And that's exactly what Perlman and his little cadre of scumbags did. They bled it dry so that they could just put it all into their own pockets. So it was tragic, because if you're on the inside, you're watching yourself escalate to literally unparalleled heights in terms of revenue and sales since World War II.
Yeah.
But you're starting to realize the slowly creeping in realization that that's not a good thing.
Yeah.
That's not a positive thing. So I'm making more money every single year, more and more than I ever thought I would honestly make in my whole life. I was making, right?
Yeah.
But I was thinking to myself, I would probably give half of this back right now if I could be assured that 10 years from now I'll get that half back, because that half will still be there. And that wasn't going to be the case, because you saw, if you had half a brain and half an understanding of business in the marketplace and people in general and psychology, you knew that they were going to burn it out really fast, and they were trying to burn it out really fast, because their goal was to raise its level so high that it couldn't sustain itself, because that's when they walk away.
Yeah, right.
Highest. And that's exactly what they did. I mean, it's exactly what they did. I mean, he declared a company bankrupt that he pocketed $330 million. You know what I mean? So, you tell me, how can a company be bankrupt when not only is the owner walking away with $330 million in his pocket, but it had a publishing revenue of $350 million a year, and a licensing revenue at that time of about $45 million a year. At the height of having 2 cartoons nationally on air every weekend with X-Men and Spider-Man, it's because they purposefully leveraged debt on the company to increase the stock price. And that was good for them because they're the ones that had the vested options.
Yeah.
But it wasn't good for the company because the company couldn't handle that leveraged debt that was placed on it. So I was already gone by the time the bankruptcy BS happened.
Yeah.
But to this day, I got to argue with people when they sit here and tell me Marvel went bankrupt in the 90s because it was publishing so much crap. And I'm like,
but that's people who don't understand the fabric of how, entertainment businesses, how publishing businesses work.
Yeah, I got to be honest, Andrew. 90% of the time, it's people who are in the industry who say that, and 90% of the time, my arguing is with people is with latter generation creative talent.
Right. Okay. Interesting.
The creative talent in their 30s and 40s now, who were 14 years old in 1995 when they were buying whatever. It's just incredible. It's incredible how a fallacy can solidify itself as reality in people's minds just because it's a pithy sentence. Marvel went bankrupt because it published so much speculator crap in the 90s. Like, the complexity of that sentence is a book's worth of information.
Absolutely.
And they want to walk away with it as if that sentence speaks to its whole. And it's exhausting. It's exhausting because I was always I was always a fan of history. I was always from the time I was 10 years old, and I saw Steranko's History of Comic Books in a bookstore. The giant tabloid volume, where I saw some of these artists like Bill Everett and guys like that, whose name might have been in some of the reprint comics, like Marvel's collector's item reprint comics.
Absolutely.
So you might have seen Bill Everett.
I love those. Yeah, right.
Yeah, but you never saw him draw a full page image of Submariner and Human Torch in all their glory. And I became incredibly interested in the history of the medium back when I was 10, 11 years old. So I got like All in Color for a dime, and I got Jules Pfeiffer's The Greatest American Heroes book. And I tried anything I could find that would help me learn about what happens in the ebb and flow of the history of the medium, and I went into Marvel in '85 having a very solid understanding of the generational ebb and flow of the business, not its details, because those only come from when you're on the inside, but a general awareness of how that tide came in and out, and I deal with a lot of creative talent in terms of our interactions nowadays who haven't necessarily had an interest in doing that kind of history, research. They just don't know.
No, it makes sense. And increasingly, of course, we live in an environment where, I noticed this working in the magazine business as well, where quality long-form journalism gets boiled down to, they use terms like snackable, consumable information. So rather than you read, 100,000 words on something, you're going to read 300 words on something. And at that point, it's just bullet point narratives. And and everything becomes very, very simplistic, and you don't, the reality is, history is something that you have to spend time with and absorb and steep yourself in order to gain some level of understanding.
And it's really, it really makes me call into question any of the history that I ever learned, because now that I see my living existence in what is considered history by others, a very fascinating sort of a journey. You hear their interpretation of history from the standpoint of how they have learned it or not learned it, as the case may be, to be fascinating when you yourself were actually there when it happened. I would love the founding fathers to have a little conversation that gets videotaped in the United States about how history presents them versus what they probably really in the day, and it's just it's frustrating. It's understandable, but it's still frustrating and annoying. It's like, that lack of awareness, I think, is just as much born of social media and what social media has done to us as anything else. I don't know that I think that social media has dumbed us down to detail to the point where it's very understandable why people only are able to digest that bite-sized bullet point, like you mentioned. It's not even an individual lack of trying. I think it's a collective inability to try. I think that's what social media has done to us. It started before social media because I like to blame Sesame Street myself, but
social media is the accelerant, isn't it? Yeah, for sure.
Social media has become the accelerant on a global level, and look, we are headed, whether it's 100 years or 200 years or 300 years, we are headed to that movie Idiocracy. We absolutely are. My only 100%. The only positive I draw from that, and it's a healthy positive, I think, is that I'll be dead before that happens. So I feel blessed that I won't be here, hopefully, unless we accelerate it a lot quicker than I expect.
Which the way we're going, it looks like we might be doing.
We very well. When it was Boris and Donald on either side of the ocean, I really got very scared there for a little while.
I mean, you're all right. I mean, we've still got our blonde-haired son of privilege, fucking jackass running the country. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. And we don't have that running the country, but we still have that as a ridiculously prevalent voice within the country. You know, it's like, you know, the person who introduced the tumors into the body may not be there, but the tumors are still there, you know?
Oh, yeah. For sure. I get it.
They really were given an opportunity to flourish just wonderfully.
Yeah.
So you know, it as far as the comics industry is concerned, I find the longer we get away from that time period, 90 to 96, the less focus the truth has to people's perceptions of it. You know, and I fought it a lot for a while, and then I realized, what do I care?
I think that is so healthy, mate. I think that is so healthy.
If I was working at Marvel and had been working there, not that there's many people, there's like 2 or 3 people at Marvel who've been there consecutively since I was there in the early 90s. If I were Tom Brevoort, I'd fight it tooth and nail every single day of my life. You know what I mean? But that's because I'm an idiot, and Tom's not an idiot. So he's smart enough to go, you know, I'll take care of the truth that I can take care of, which is my own truth. I won't worry about everybody else's truth. You know, I would have probably be the opposite and just exhaust myself on a daily basis trying to explain reality to people. You know? I'm so removed from it now, and especially in the last 5 years, my brain just really started to turn in different directions. That it's really a part of my past that has a lot of good in it and a little bad, like anybody's hopefully does, you know. And I just move forward, you know. I just move on. But certainly, I'll be honest with you. From after I left Acclaim in '98 until the mid-aughts, 2005 or 6 or so, I was still emotionally invested in my mind in Marvel. I was still emotionally invested in what I could have done or should have done, or you know, and that was unhealthy because it was kind of stupid, frankly. So
how long were you there for, from beginning to end, Fabian?
Yeah, August of '85 until, I think, I'm not even sure, December of '95.
Yeah, because, I mean, it's 10 years of your life, man.
Yeah, that last year, I was only going in a couple days a week as a consultant.
Yeah,
kind of like I did. They wanted me to still be in the office, but I was doing so much writing, and they understood that. So I was like basically an interdepartmental ombudsman. My job was just to talk to people in every department when I was in and create a report that I would give to the different higher ups about things going on and what I saw, positive, negative, almost as an outsider's perspective, in a way, with an insider's knowledge, you know. And I did that for most of '95, and then that was it. And then I was done.
That's a very interesting way to bow out, I think. Before we move on, I want to explore some of your current focus. But just before we do that, when you look back on that 10-year period, if you look back dispassionately upon your time at Marvel, what would you say represents your absolute peak in terms of being an editor, in terms of what you're most proud of, and then in terms of being a writer, what is it that you're most proud of?
Well, as an overall whole, I'll answer, when I look back on that, I consider it the greatest time of my life, and I hope the next 10 years top it. But as far as a collective whole, the what I learned, how I grew, what I became, and the people I interacted with, it was the best time of my life. And many people who were there around that same time will say the same thing. So that being the overall caveat, the bad stuff becomes secondary to all of the good, right?
Yeah.
And I'm glad about that. I'm glad that I didn't leave with the bad overwhelming the good. You know, so that's still a positive in my mind. So for me, from an advertising standpoint, the single ad I did that I love the most was this half-page black and white mutant registration ad. It had 4 black and white pictures of little kids. The last one is Franklin Richards, and it has the word Muty scrawled over his face. And the headline was, "It's 1987. Do you know what your children are?" And it was paid for by citizens for the Mutant Registration Act. Wasn't advertising a comic book. Wasn't advertising anything yet because it was a teaser ad. The Mutant Registration storyline wasn't going to run until later that year. And I had a half page available to me because an ad sales thing happened where I had a half page. So I had John Bogdanov do the art, and he used duotone shading to do the black and white images of the kids. You can look it up online. You can Google it. And to this day, people still say, "I was 8 years old. I saw that in the comic and I froze. It scared the hell out of me." And we got 50 letters of complaint about that ad from parents. And that to me was my crowning achievement in terms of advertising, because if you can get 50 parents to complain about an ad you did, you clearly must have been doing something
extremely
right.
well.
Yeah. So I loved my advertising manager job. I only left it because it burned me out. I'd done so much of it that I was repeating myself, and I needed to stop doing it, and I needed to do something else. But I loved the job. So among many things I'm really proud of at that time period, that ad was my single personal greatest accomplishment. As far as an editor is concerned, that's an interesting one. It's not so much a single issue that I can recall, because I wasn't a very happy editor. I didn't like it that much. Not the least of which was I edited most of the licensed books. So I had to interact a lot with outside licensing departments
and I know what that's like. That's part of my working life.
Many of them, as you know, are incredibly stupid people. Talk about bullet points, man. So bullet points are even too complicated for them. They just want the little circle. So probably the success that we turned Ren and Stimpy into is something I was very proud of, because I hired my intern who had only written a couple of stories to be the writer of the book, and that's a bit of a risk, but I knew how smart he was and what an idea man he was, and that little kid Dan Slott clearly grew into quite an accomplished comic book writer over the last 30 years. But I hired him to write an inventory story for me on Mighty Mouse, and then I offered him Ren and Stimpy, and it was golden, because the book was a challenge to do, and we were selling over 300,000 copies a month. So, we were working really hard within the parameters that were unfairly being placed on us by Nickelodeon to be softer than the actual TV show they were airing was. And we succeeded quite well with it.
It's funny you should pick that, because an old friend of mine here in the UK, a comics editor, he's a comics editor at Titan, actually. Is a guy called David Manley Leach, and David Leach used to be the editor of Ren and Stimpy at Marvel UK, almost certainly at exactly the same time. So I remember talking to him about some of his experiences, in terms of putting the UK book together. So it sounds like you both had a very similar experience.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure. Look, every licensing department, I had to train 3 different licensing departments at Mattel on how comic books are made within a 1-year span on Barbie. Because pre-launching the book, I had to fly out to LA and teach Mattel what comics are and how it's different than anything they've ever done with Barbie. Then once I got them to understand it, at least to the degree that allowed me to begin to commission stories and get art done on them, because the book had been languishing for a year under the previous editor, Sid Jacobson, who wasn't able to get either the right talent or to get Mattel to understand that they were entering new territory with Barbie, who had never really been used in storytelling formats before. So I got that licensing department understanding what we were doing, and they all got fired in mass, I think by issue 6 of Barbie. So I had to reteach an entire new licensing department, and then it happened again right as I was ready to stop my tenure at Barbie. And I think Hildy Mesnick inherited the third licensing regime that I had to deal with. Nickelodeon was a different beast, because my main licensing contact was a wonderful woman. Her name was Susan Lapuzniak. She was young, in her 20s, really vibrant and positive and understanding completely of what we were doing. It was just that she was so young, she didn't have as much experience internally at Nickelodeon to navigate their minefield on our behalf. But she was always fighting on our behalf. And that was rare too, to have a licensing contact who fights for you, And so we loved her. She was great, and she kept climbing up the ladder, and she moved on to do a lot of good things in licensing. But in that time period, it was Nickelodeon above her level, who was terrified that Ren and Stimpy was so successful because it was so edgy for what they thought of themselves as, that they wanted the licensing to be what they thought of themselves as instead of the product they were putting on air, which made no sense to me whatsoever. Because if you want it to be softer, then how is that in any way, shape, or form driving you to the cartoon? And you should want the cartoon to appeal to the audience that's buying it, And I can understand them thinking consumer products are going to be minimal for this property if it's so scary and adult, because no little kids are going to want to buy plush Ren and Stimpy toys. And I get that, but you're the ones airing the cartoon.
Yeah. Mate, it's so interesting talking to you about this, because I think that working within licensed creative endeavor is one of the most massively documented elements of not just the comics business, but the TV and movie business as well. And it's something that, broadly speaking, if you haven't worked in the media, there's no books written about this stuff. There's no stories about behind the scenes of our licensing relationship with X, Y, and Z. And it's such a fascinating. But if you've ever touched any of those industries, you'll know what a big deal it actually is, and how much of your time can be absorbed dealing with those kind of relationships.
I had an 8 to 10 title line, and I think 7 of them were licensed properties.
Yeah.
So it was ridiculous. And I wasn't a good editor, and my assistants had to do a tremendous brunt of the work. And I had 2 really good assistants, Evan Skolnick first, and then Carlos Lopez afterwards. And they had to handle a brunt load of the work, because I couldn't navigate dealing with the licensors as much as I had to, combined with all the writing I was doing freelance and the lack of sleep, because I was averaging, I think, 3 to 4 hours a night every night back then for a couple of years. And as a result, they had to handle almost the brunt of all of the internal trafficking, all of the scheduling, most of the freelancer relations, quite frankly, because I didn't have the time or the patience in my brain to deal with freelancers who weren't turning in work. So I wasn't a good editor, because being an editor requires you to be a good psychological babysitter. And I was not. I just wasn't. I couldn't handle someone giving me an excuse for why they didn't hand in the work when I had the load on my plate that I had. Because I also was going through, my parents were divorcing at that time after 30 years of marriage. My girlfriend's mother was dying of cancer, like we talked about when we talked earlier last time about 2 young kids. So it was a lot. I was buying my first townhouse at that time, and then going from the townhouse a few years later to a house. All those life burdens that you're getting hit with for the first time in your life when you're in your late 20s, early 30s. I don't need an artist, flipping his hair in front of me when I'm losing all of mine, telling me he didn't hand pages. He didn't hand pages in for 3 weeks because he didn't feel the mojo. And you're like,
right, man. I'm trying to support an entire family here. I'm trying to lead my life. You know what, mate? This is such an interesting thing to discuss that maybe we should come back to it some other time, because it's largely undocumented, largely undiscussed, but it's what you're talking about, of course, is the reality, the fabric of what being an editor is actually like. When you've got a 9-to-5 gig at a company that you work for, and it's very, very different to what people who sit outside the industry think it is, because the reality is.
But to be honest with you, I think that the reality for editors today is very different than my experience, just because the digital transfer of content has really changed the dynamics of interaction for editors. And I can't speak at all to how editors have to do things today and interact today. I don't know that I would want to be an editor today, not just because I think the job is thankless, but because I think that a lot of the interpersonal interactions have kind of been taken away a little bit from them as a result of all the digital transfer.
Yeah, I think that's true, mate. And before we transition into talking about what you're doing right now, when you look back on your comics writing, what is the thing that you think is the purest distillation of you as a comics writer that you look back on it and go, man, those are the books, or that is the book that I'm proudest of, or the thing that I'm proudest of?
Probably New Warriors 1 through 53. I wrote the book for the first 53 issues, and I think more so than Nomad, which was a more personal book for me than New Warriors was, but it was a failed experiment to me in hindsight because I didn't have the experience or the maturity to tell those stories right. The fact I wanted to tell those stories says something, and I'm pleased and proud of what it says about me back then, that I wanted to tell the kinds of stories we told in Nomad, but my lack of ability to execute those stories will always kind of dampen that in comparison to New Warriors, which far and away succeeded both financially, commercially, and I believe artistically to achieve what I wanted it to be, which was a very entertaining but also thought-provoking mainstream Marvel superhero title. You know, so to me, it's not even hands down, far and away, as a result of the execution matching the intent, and then the reaction matching the execution. Because of that, it's by far the most kind of symbiotic synthesis of what I wanted to be back then. And I think that, you know, fandom of that book is still quite alive and still quite vibrant. And it was a top 25 book, but it was never a top 10 book. And they all feel the same way I felt back then, which is you're part of something that is not necessarily part of what other people are aware of. You know, it's our little 250,000 person clique. You know,
which is, as a fan, is always a lovely place to be. And I think the fact that you also that it's all you for that 50 issue run, I think means that, you know, it feels like a body of work when you read it. That sense of identification and ownership is enhanced if you have it's like I loved your Nomad, by the way, mate. I thought it was great, but it's very interesting hearing you talking about how, and I'm aware of that creative dissonance of sometimes what your intention is doesn't match what your personal delivery is, and that's always a complex relationship. But as a fan, I love Nomad. I thought it was great.
For the most part in my career, I think that I've only successfully, in my mind, executed to my intention, and that was New Warriors, Cable and Deadpool, and Robin, Tim Drake, Red Robin.
Yeah.
When I got to write the bookends of that, you know, that's it. I've done some good work on Thunderbolts. I've done some good work on Gambit. It's just that those three titles are the only times in my entire career. Now we're talking about a lot of comics, so clearly I've failed far more often in my mind than I've succeeded. Those are the only times where all three things merged the way they did with New Warriors, you know. So it'll always be the fondest memory I will have, I believe, in my comics career, because of what it meant to me, what it meant to me at that time, at that age, and to have that opportunity and to basically, you know, grab the brass ring, as it were, because it succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. And the reason that happened is because the stories were good, the characters were good, the people who were reading it were enjoying it and telling other people, you got to read it. It wasn't a word of mouth based on hype for hype, like I think the X books often were. You know,
true, man. So true.
I mean, it was hype. It was hype based on the people liking what they were reading, not hyping it because they thought they should be reading. You know,
I think it was a very grassroots book in the way that you said. It wasn't a question of a marketing campaign saying to you, man, you got to read this, which, by the way, we can have a whole conversation about. That's my view of a whole. As much as I'm a Marvel fan, I've got quite a big void in my Marvel knowledge, which is once X-Men gets beyond the kind of Claremont and Byrne era, and once it becomes the sprawling, multi-book soap opera that it became, very much driven by like sales and marketing, I had a lot of trouble identifying with it at that point. So while I read everything up to a certain point, once you hit the 90s, my X-Men reading massively takes a step back for that
Andrew,
reason.
I was writing a lot of that, and I couldn't connect to it.
And that's it. But to have the grassroots success that you had, and the love, therefore, that your New Warriors fans have, I can totally understand why that's special to you. And speaking of being in that sweet spot of working on stuff that you love, let's close out by having a chat about the genesis of your new book, Suburban Dicks. For anybody who's listening to this who doesn't know, one of the things that I do is edit noir fiction. So this is a subject. We've talked about this book before, but it's a subject that's very close to my heart. I'm very, very pleased that my day job at Titan that we're involved with it in the outside of the US publishing. But if you could just get into what the book is and how it came to be. I'd love to hear you talk about that a bit more.
Those are two interestingly different.
Yeah.
What the book is a sarcastic suburban mystery about a 33-year-old pregnant with her fifth child homemaker who should have been an FBI profiler, but the birth of the first child derailed her career in her mind, and a 29-year-old reporter who in college won a Pulitzer Prize in journalism and now at 29 is working for a weekly suburban newspaper. And how the two of them get together to try to solve the murder of a gas station attendant in West Windsor, New Jersey, a small, semi-affluent suburban town, and how that murder is actually part of a cover-up of a deeper story and a deeper incident that occurred 50 years earlier that ends up having tangled roots in the police and the government structure of West Windsor, New Jersey, and speaks very strongly in a humorous, sarcastic manner, I've been told by the reviews, about
which have been great, by the way. The reviews have been spectacular. Yeah. I can say that because I'm not you, but I want the people, everybody's listening to this, know the book's phenomenal. You'll get a real kick out of it.
So, the book's themes really, as much as solving a murder mystery, the book's themes really are about white fear of change and the cultural demographic changes that are occurring in many of our suburbs. I think the UK suburbs are just as illustrative of this point as the US suburbs are, and how that fear of change drives people from the ability to accept the other. So, it's a Jewish female lead and an Asian American co-lead as far as the book is concerned. And because the town that the mystery is set in is actually the town that I live in, which is like 60% Asian population from China, Korea, India, Pakistan, and a diminishing slowly percentage of Caucasians over the last 30 years. I think that ultimately is what the book is about, but it gets there through the murder mystery procedural and kind of the quirkiness of the two leads. So Kirkus gave it a starred review. Publishers Weekly gave it a starred review.
Yeah.
Booklist only gave it an A-. I was very disappointed in that. I'm only kidding, Booklist.
Hey, mate, coming out of the gate and getting the reviews you have off Kirkus and off Publishers Weekly, that's great going. That really is.
Yeah, because of my lack of real awareness and not having a pulse on publishing for so long, I'm following my publisher's lead in terms of understanding their enthusiasm. So they're really enthusiastic about it, and I'm glad. I have a very healthy skepticism about reviews in general, mostly because I never usually get good ones. My good ones come from the fans, generally not from the publications. And the minute like the Eisners nominate me for a comic book award is the minute that that the Eisner should cease to exist, because any organization that would want me as a member is not an organization I would want to be a member of.
Well said.
I was aware of Publishers Weekly from back in my days in publishing, in book publishing, and I was aware of Kirkus, but it's almost ephemeral for me at this point, because it's been 30 plus years, almost 40 now, since I worked at Berkeley Publishing, right? I left Berkeley Publishing in 1985, I'm sorry. So I'm like, it's a part of a world that I kind of stopped being actively engaged in a long time ago. And just because I wrote the book doesn't in any way, shape, or form make me think that I'm a part of the book publishing world, because I feel like an intruder, an outsider. I'm the obnoxious guest at the party, So I'm just taking all of it with a grain of salt, because if I didn't live or die by reviews for the last 30 years in the comic book marketplace, I really shouldn't in the book marketplace either. Ultimately, to me, sales have always been my barometer, unfortunately, because it's the cheap thing I had to fall back on. So it is the only thing that provided me security and a salve for my soul. If it sells, then that means people are interested in it, and then if the second book sells, that means people like the first book. So I'm going to try to stick with that. I'm going to try to stick with sales being a barometer for people's engagement and interest.
And Fabian, you're already contracted to do the second book, am I right?
Yes, I've already actually finished the second manuscript book, and it's back in the editor's hands after some tweaking and rewriting. The manuscript went back to them. There's no title for it yet, because we're negotiating on the title. I don't think it's going to be Suburban Dicks 2. I think it's going to be title and then a Suburban Dicks mystery underneath it.
Lovely. Okay.
That's and I hope that it'll get picked up for UK again. I hope Titan wants to do the second book, and I hope that I get a contract offer to do more, because I would like to do more. I'm not Janet Ivanovich or Sue Grafton. I don't have 26 of these in me until I'm 90 something. But I know I have 5 or 6 solid stories that I'd like to tell with Suburban Dicks, and I know that I have some spin-off things I'd like to do with some of the characters as well. If I get an opportunity to do that in the next 10 years, that'd be great. It'd be gravy. It'd be gravy or icing on the cake of the career, as it.
It'll be both, everything from soup to nuts. That, I have to say, mate, is a very hard degree from me, because I want you to have the space to explore these characters further. And the fact that you've got the concepts that you have up there inside your head already, that's a great place to be when you're just publishing, your first installment. And,
see that based on being a comic book guy, and then based on working on story world development for franchise characters for Hollywood studios and all that stuff, I've always had that Marvel universe mentality, characters in an interconnected story world, right? The combination of that DNA in me with the fact that the original impetus for the book started in 1994, 1995. So I've had this book, these characters, this story in my head since 1995. It wasn't always present or prevalent in my creative thought patterns, but there's always a road I would drive by that had an interesting name. I go, oh, that would be interesting in the book that never existed, or read an article in a newspaper and you go, oh, that would make an interesting suburban mystery for the Suburban Dicks that don't exist anywhere but my own brain, and that was 20 years of that. I didn't start writing the book until 2017 for real. I tried a couple times in the decades prior, but I stopped really quickly. We're talking about 15, 20 pages in. I just stopped because I shrieked like a baby and ran away. So, but the ideas never left. They always percolated. I discussed them as being possibly a graphic novel line 10 years ago with someone, but no one was going to buy a graphic novel line of suburban mysteries from me when they're expecting spandex and fights. You know what I mean? So it just became it became this thing that I always had and never thought would be. Now that it is when the arrogance starts kicking in, and I wanted to succeed enough so that I could do more.
Yeah.
Now I want to tell the offshoot stories that I want to tell. So I hope it does well enough. I would like it because it'll make for ultimately it'll make for a really fun 10 to 15 years. I'm turning 60 this year, so if I could do this until I'm 70 or 75, wow, that'd be kind of a miraculous cap to all of it.
Fabian, I'm sure you will. It's a great book. It's a real. Anybody who's listening to this and picks it up, you will see it's a real treat. And I think that's a great moment for us to round out this lengthy conversation about your wonder years at Marvel from 85 to 95, and our mutual beginnings in the production era, your background in sales, and just the great work you're doing with Suburban Dicks, which is available from Putnam in the US and from Titan Books in the UK. And it is a great and truly rewarding read that everybody listening to this will really enjoy. And mate, it's always great to chat with you, brother. It's
great to talk to you too, Andrew. I really appreciate it. And I just want all the readers to know that what you just said about the book, it was 100% accurate. So I don't want them to think that you were lying to them or overhyping. You're right. It is that good, everybody. So please go get it. Why would you want to deprive yourself of something so good in your life is what I'm thinking.
So true. I'm famous, world famous, for telling the absolute truth. And I would never steer anybody wrong. It's a great book, and it's always great to see you, Fabian. You take care of yourself,
It's good
brother.
to see you too, Andrew. Thank you very much for the time. I appreciate it.
Take care, mate. All the best. Bye-bye.
Take care.
You've been listening to Hard Agree. This episode was edited by John Horsley and Kenrick Regan, and our theme music, Golden, was written and performed for this show by Liverpool's finest band, Denio. Hard Agree is a production of the Spoilerverse and myself, Andrew Sumner.